Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell. I'm going to be your host here tonight, and I'm, as always, with Dr. Clay Zimmerman, my trusty, rusty co-host. Clay, welcome. Good to see you again.
Yep, good to be here.
Yep. Today, we are at the Florida Ruminant Nutrition Symposium, and we're recording a series of podcasts on beef on dairy. And this is the second of three. So if you missed the first one, please go back and listen to the first one with Dr. Tara Felix. It was a great podcast and it'll help. And this one will build on that one. Our featured guest for this session is going to be Dr. Brad Johnson from Texas Tech. And he's going to give a talk here at the conference called Beef on Dairy Cattle, Advancing Beef Quality to the Next Level. So this is going to be all about muscle and carcass. So welcome, Brad. Welcome back. This is officially your second time back at the Real Science Exchange. So we always like to see people returning. Would you mind just kind of, I know you did it the first time, but give us another real quick overview of yourself.
Sure. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast, Scott and Clay. So again, my name is Brad Johnson. I'm a professor at Texas Tech University. I'm in the Gordon W. Davis Regents Chair of Meat Science and Muscle Biology position. I've been there at Texas Tech for 17 years. Native of South Dakota, I grew up on a family feedlot and farming operation in northeast South Dakota. Did my undergrad work at South Dakota State University a long time ago. And then did my master's and PhD at the University of Minnesota on St. Paul campus, and actually was officed with a lot of dairy nutritionists that are still actively involved in the industry today. So that was fun to kind of get some hybrid thoughts with them during my grad time. So I've had 3 faculty positions. I was an extension, my first faculty position, I went home to South Dakota. I was an extension beef feedlot specialist for 3.5 years in Brookings. Worked with the local beef producers of South Dakota. But when I was in grad school at Minnesota, I did really basic muscle growth and muscle biology research, and that was my passion and still my passion today. So Kansas State had never had a person in that area. And so I moved. I had no ties to K-State, but moved our family to Manhattan, Kansas in 2000, and I was on faculty in a research teaching role for 8 years in Manhattan. The neat thing there, I was in call hall with all the ruminant nutritionists again. So even though I was doing muscle biology work, I had a really strong ruminant nutrition cohort and background as well. Had no reason to leave K-State. We love Manhattan. But the opportunity to take this chair position was just professionally too good of a deal. So we've lived in Lubbock, Texas now for 17 years. But I'm basically doing the same research in Lubbock that I started doing in Manhattan.
Well, welcome back. Looking forward to the conversation today. We've got a special guest, Dr. Tara Felix from Penn State. Welcome back. This is officially your second time back here at the pubcast. And if you'll do the same, just kind of give us a real brief overview of yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Happy to be here today as well. So my background is I left Pennsylvania. So Brad talked about going home. I left Pennsylvania after my undergraduate degree from Penn State. Came down to University of Florida and studied trace mineral nutrition with Dr. Lee McDowell. And then went up and got a PhD at Ohio State, which I don't share around Pennsylvania too much because they get a little upset about that. Went to Ohio State and got my PhD in feedlot nutrition and management right around the time that the energy department increased distillers grain. So I'll give you 3 guesses what my PhD was on, right? I was on faculty then at the University of Illinois for about 4 years when Dr. Terry Etherton called me and said, hey, would you like to come back home to Penn State? We have an extension position open. Took that opportunity to move my family back home and have been there since 2016. So now in a predominantly extension and teaching appointment at Penn State and get to do a lot of work with producers throughout the state. Really enjoy my time there.
While at Illinois, did you do any work with Dr. Jim Drakely?
I did some work. Now, Jim did a lot of dairy work, and I was heavily focused on the feedlot industry while I was at Illinois. So we
Okay.
didn't cross paths too much.
All right, very well. We just honored Dr. Drakely in our Legacy series on the podcast.
Right.
So that just was published the other day. And he's here at the conference as well. So
Yeah. Looking forward to catching
Yeah.
up with him.
yeah, he's a good man.
New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Brad, why don't we just jump right into it? Just give us a brief overview, some of the key points that you're going to be talking about in your presentation later today.
Sure. So I really want to focus, and I'm going to build on what Dr. Felix is going to talk in before me on beef on dairy from both a dairy and feedlot perspective. But I really want to build on the meat quality aspect of this product. So as we talked about on the earlier podcasts, and listeners might want to go back and listen to that, we kind of had a transition time in 2017, as Dr. Felix said, where some of the packers would no longer accept straight calf-fed Holsteins. They put a height limit on it, and that really forced the industry, I think, to look at alternatives, and that was probably the genesis of the beef on dairy aspect. So what's interesting is, I think early on, we wanted to show that beef on dairy, the carcass quality and the ultimate meat quality, the beef quality of beef on dairy, that maybe we made improvements above a straight dairy influenced animal, either a calf-fed Holstein steer or a Jersey steer or something like that. And in fact, I'm going to show we've more than surpassed that, both from a red meat yield standpoint, total pounds of red meat yield. But more importantly, there's aspects of beef on dairy from a very fundamental muscle fiber type that is different from a straight dairy animal, but also different than a straight beef animal, and it lends itself to really high quality beef. Both from a marbling standpoint, that's the amount of intramuscular fat, but also from a tenderness and color standpoint. So I'm going to go through some data of a former grad student of mine, Dr. Luke Furness, his dissertation work, where we looked at half siblings raised in a conventional beef system, and then that same Angus semen was used to breed Holstein cows to get an F1 of an Angus Holstein cross. We had a dairy right across the street, a father-son dairy in eastern New Mexico, that we bred Jersey cows to the same bull. And then we worked with the HerdFlex group, the Simplot group, and we used the same semen to generate IVF embryos and put all beef embryos in either Holstein and Jersey cows. And so it was a great model to look at how calf management, either at the calf ranch or in a commercial cow-calf situation, how that could impact feedlot performance and ultimately carcass quality. So I'm going to use that model and then take it all the way down to the individual muscle fiber level and talk about how changes in the fibers that make up the muscle that ultimately make up your ribeye steak or your strip loin steak. The beef on dairy does that when we combine the beef genetics with the dairy. it has a very positive impact on the meat quality, and I'll spend most of my time talking about that. So.
Yeah. So why don't you dig into that right now? Tell us what are some of those differences, and
Sure.
what are you seeing, and what causes some of these differences?
So historically, I talked about how the packers started pushing back on some of these straight calf-fed Holsteins about 10 years ago.
Yeah, because of frame size.
8 to 9 years ago. A lot of it due to frame size. But all along, there's been pockets in the United States of feedlots and packers that have embraced, say, calf-fed Holstein beef for many years. And in fact, a large pocket of feedlots are in Southern California in the Imperial Valley. And these feedlots built their own packing plant called Brawley Beef, and then National went on to buy that. But there's a JBS plant very close to it outside of Phoenix, Tolleson, Arizona, and they embraced those animals, and they found markets for those. And dairy-influenced beef is very tender, it's highly marbled, so it's a very high palatability traits.
And I think you said in the last podcast, it's kind of the right size, too, for a lot of restaurants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the ribeye is a little bit smaller. But one issue that retailers have had with dairy-influenced beef, so like calf-fed Holsteins, is because the fiber type is different. They have more red fibers or oxidative fibers. Those fibers are prone to lipid peroxidation. They have more myoglobin content. That's why they're redder. The muscle looks red. That myoglobin will go through a discoloration when it's in a retail package in the supermarket. And in fact, if you compare calf-fed Holstein beef to traditional native beef, ribeye or strip steaks might discolor 2 days faster from calf-fed Holsteins. Retailers don't like that because if they can't sell that at a high wholesale or retail cost for a ribeye steak, which is really high, they have to end up grinding it for ground beef. And obviously, there's probably about a $4 to $5 a pound difference in just their wholesale costs by doing that. So many retailers would stay away from dairy-influenced beef because of this discoloration issue in the retail
What's it turn
case.
brown, or what's it?
What's that?
What color does it turn brown?
Yeah, it turns brown. So myoglobin goes through many phases of reduction. And so the average consumer, if you ever go into a large supermarket chain on a Monday morning, they will have ribeyes and strip loins marked down 50%, right? And that's when my wife goes and she buys every one of those that she can find, because the average consumer thinks this discoloration may be contamination, but in fact there's nothing wrong with that steak. It's a conversion of different phases of the myoglobin over time in the retail package. But the average consumer doesn't realize that and thinks there's something wrong with the steak, so they choose not to buy it, and ultimately they'll have to grind it into ground beef and mix it together. And so what's interesting is what we have found with the beef on dairy from a meat quality perspective, their retail display life is more like native beef than it is calf-fed Holsteins. And the retailers have realized that now and have embraced that and realized that, hey, this meat will stay in the retail case just as long as native beef will. And so I'll share some of that data in my presentation as well. So that's been a huge positive aspect of beef on dairy beef from a whole supply chain standpoint, because these large retailers have learned that the discoloration is less with that compared to more traditional calf-fed Holstein beef.
And so then what can you tell us about the differences in whether it's frame size, ribeye area, round? What kind of differences are you seeing there?
So another big part of my talk, it's amazing what the genetic companies have done, how they can use tools like ultrasound. So they will use ultrasound to generate EPDs based, instead of waiting for progeny data, they will start ultrasounding both sires as well as progeny. And so one thing we learned in our study, and we see this across the board, that ribeye size in our study, there was no difference in ribeye size at the 12th rib, measured in square inches or square centimeters, between any of our cattle groups, including a straight calf-fed Holstein. They all averaged about 14.2 square inches, okay? So those of you that remember that maybe had selection, livestock and meat evaluation classes as an undergrad, we've been using the USDA yield grade equation for several years, and the main determinant of muscling in that equation is ribeye size. So we will measure ribeye at the 12th rib, we'll measure fat thickness over the 12th rib, we'll take hot carcass weight, and we do an estimate of kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, or internal fat. And so basically what happens with beef on dairy, they have the same ribeye size, they're actually leaner, they have less back fat, which is a positive. They will consistently have 0.15 to 0.2 inch, 0.2 of an inch less back fat than a native beef animal. So there's less waste subcutaneous fat. So their yield grade always comes in lower number, which is a positive, more red meat yield. But in fact, we've learned that they don't have more red meat yield compared to a native beef because they give so much up in their hindquarter. And so another focal point of my talk is I'm going to talk about what can we do genetically or management or nutritionally to try to increase the muscle development in the hindquarter. I think the last frontier for beef on dairy is if we can get more muscling in the hindquarter, they will be identical, or I would say they'll even be better than native beef. If we can increase the red meat yield in the hindquarter, all the other traits of the meat quality aspect are so positive for beef on dairy that I think we will have a better carcass than we could potentially get with native beef if we can fix the red meat yield in the lower half or the hindquarter.
You need the Belgian blue in there.
So in fact, I've seen some pictures. I'm sure this individual has graced you on your podcast, but Dr. Lance Baumgard was an undergrad at Minnesota. Man, he was, I love that guy, and I was a graduate student at Minnesota when he was an undergrad, and he and I were on a program a couple years ago, and I was talking about beef on dairy. He was talking about transition cows or gut health, but later on he was in Italy, and he sent me pictures of Belgian blue on Holstein cross calves, and beautiful. Dr. Felix talked about the hide color, right? The beautiful looking calves, but you could just see in the hutch the muscle development due to the double muscled breed Belgian blue. The problem with those kind of breeds, the reason they have twice as many muscle fibers at birth, they have a mutation in a protein called myostatin. And that job of myostatin is to limit muscle growth. So if you mutate that protein, you get twice as much muscle at birth. So not only do you have a calving difficulty problem because they're such big calves, there's a direct link. When you mutate myostatin and you take away myostatin, you also take away marbling. So those breeds, they essentially have no marbling. And so I talked a little bit about fiber type. Myostatin or double muscle breeds like Belgian blue and Piedmontese, they're all glycolytic muscle fibers. They have no oxidative fibers. And that's one reason they don't have marbling. You have to have the oxidative fibers to have the marbling. But so you might think, well, then they're going to be very tough because they have no small fibers. But in fact, because they have twice as many muscle fibers, even though they're glycolytic, they're very tender because the cross-sectional area of those fibers is only half the size as native beef. And so that's a positive. But the one of the problems is marbling is so valuable right now. The value of prime over choice, as Dr. Felix said in her podcast, the export market. So the double muscling gene will basically deplete these animals of marbling. So.
Brad, you talked about the difference in the hindquarter, and Blake Foraker had done some work on that where he
Yep.
separated breeds out, right? He separated those beef on dairy crosses out into high yielding and low yielding, and talked a lot about the hindquarter. In your particular study, you had one Angus sire, is that correct?
Yep.
Do you think selection in that Angus sire, or selection criteria of that Angus sire, maybe limited your findings from a yield standpoint?
Oh, absolutely. Because what we did, Dr. Felix, is we selected a bull that was in the top 1% for marbling. And if you look at a picture of this bull, it was Momentum, Angus bull out of Gardner's, called Momentum, that Select Sires owns. He's very light muscled himself. Okay, so we we did it for the marbling aspect, and we had almost 65% prime carcasses in our study, so we achieved our goal. But we selected a probably very light muscled Angus sire to put on dairy animals, and so I think you're exactly right. That impacted, and I'll show our data where the beef on dairy actually had smaller round circumferences than the native beef. But universally, as you look at, we've sent graduate students across the country to score some of these beef on dairy cattle in the feedlot right before they go to harvest. And even like a Sim Angus Holstein cross, we see tremendous variation. And I'll show a picture of that, and it's Dr. Foraker's picture, Blake's picture, where half sibs standing next to each other in a commercial feedlot in southwest Kansas. One looks like a beef animal, very wide hindquarter, and its half brother right next to it looks like a Holstein. That's the variation we need to fix. And we have some preliminary data that I'll actually end my talk with today, where I think the nutrition of those animals in the calf hutch, I think we can actually improve hindquarter muscling by the plane of nutrition that we feed those calves the first 60 to 70 days in the hutch. So that's what I'll end with this afternoon. So.
Yeah.
I remember Blake's picture. In fact, I think I pulled it out of my slide deck this morning, so that's good. You'll have it in yours. His calves, if I recall correctly, that paper was one of the earlier beef on dairy papers, and in the previous podcast, we talked a lot about that variation. Are we making any progress? Do you think we're making any progress in that round in particular?
I think so. What it's going to take, kind of a sidebar comment to this discussion today, and I'm not on this committee, but two of my colleagues, Dr. Blake Foraker was a PhD student under Dr. Dale Warner, who's one of my colleagues at Texas Tech, and Dr. Foraker went. He's actually a K-Stater, did his undergrad he's from Wichita, Kansas, but he was on faculty at Washington State for a couple years and just came back this past summer to be a colleague or a faculty member at Texas Tech. So what was interesting, or what I want to go with is, I talked about how the USDA yield grade equation that was set up to measure red meat yield of beef carcasses, the main determinant of muscling is ribeye. And these genetic companies, we have normalized ribeye size. I think it proves to me that they set out on a mission. They can uniformly get all these animals to have the same ribeye size, but that's just a section of the carcass, right? So, what they have shown, there's a think tank through NCBA where they're trying to come up with alternative ways to predict red meat yield of a beef carcass. And the main thing is that because of the beef on dairy, I think we've learned some of these animals are really light muscled in the hindquarter, and there's a lot of pounds of red meat in that round or the red hindquarter. And so they're looking at, scanning techniques, CAT scan, MRI techniques, other laser type technology, taking certain measurements of the round and putting that with the ribeye size, for example. So I think we've made progress, but as you talked about in the earlier podcast, Tara, we have so many different breed combinations, right? There are certain niche markets where they'll put a Wagyu on a Jersey and have tremendous marbling, but you talk about light muscled animals, they define it. And so I think if you're feeding into a certain niche beef market, that's really high marbling score, then you can get away with less muscle. But one thing that Blake's dissertation work from Texas Tech showed is that the highest 25% of beef on dairy were as good or better than native beef.
Right.
But the lower 25% were about the same as a calf-fed Holstein. And so that's the variation you talked about. And I think we have made improvements. We got to get the genetic companies to help us. And we need some more basic data to understand why can the ribeye be the same size, but yet the muscles that make up the hindquarter don't get the same proliferation or muscle hypertrophy. And I'll share some of that data this afternoon. So.
I want to circle back, Brad, on a comment you made about being able to change how much muscle is deposited in that hindquarter through the nutrition of that calf in the hutch. So that's going to impact, right, our customers out there listening to this. So what does that look like?
So we had an opportunity to go in to a large feed company, one of the largest in the country, and they have a research facility in the middle of the country. I won't mention any names, but they allowed us to take muscle biopsies on calves in the hutch, where they were looking at what they called low plane of nutrition versus high plane of nutrition. And I'll show the average daily gain. It was substantial differences in average daily gain of, I believe almost a half a pound per day in the hutch for about a 56-day window. And it really focused probably on proteins, amino acids. So this is at a time where you kind of have rumen development going on. Our last biopsies were taken at 56 days. So still probably a pre-ruminant calf for the most part, but starting to get some rumen function. And so the key was probably protein, specifically amino acids. Yep. And so what's interesting is we were able to get muscle biopsies on these light calves from the longissimus muscle, which makes up the ribeye and the strip loin, and the bicep femoris in the hindquarter, which is noted for in animals that are a little more heavy muscled. We get a lot more muscle hypertrophy in the bicep femoris in those animals. And so just like our carcass data of all these other studies suggest, so we took muscle biopsies, and I have a new procedure in the lab where we can take individual muscle fibers out of that muscle biopsy mix, put them in a dish, and you can, and I'll show pictures of these individual fibers in a petri dish or a tissue culture dish. After a couple days, satellite cells that are associated with those fibers that are the rate limiting step of postnatal muscle growth, these are cells that are able to divide yet. Certain factors like steroid hormones impact their rate of proliferation. But these satellite cells start falling off these fibers. And then we can measure, we have markers to determine how many of satellite cells there are per fiber. And interestingly, regardless of low versus high plane of nutrition, the longissimus cells acted the same. Just like we see now, ribeye size is the same in beef on dairy compared to beef, right? But the differences were in the hindquarter muscle. The high plane nutrition cells that came from those fibers were much more active at proliferation compared to low plane of nutrition. We actually, they just harvested those animals. They were fed out. Dr. Paul Beck at Oklahoma State fed those out. And so we're interested in, we weren't able to get any more tissue samples at the packing plant, but he took a bunch of measurements of like the round circumference. So it'd be interesting to see if that difference was carried all the way through to harvest. But I think it's knowledge like that of knowing the fundamentals of the muscle growth, and then how certain nutrients, like maybe amino acids and other nutrients, can impact the development of those cells that ultimately are going to lead to an increase in muscle mass in the hindquarter.
Yeah. Related to that, Tara, you're a nutritionist, right? How much do we really know about the nutritional requirements for maximizing performance in that young calf, right? In dairy cattle, we're not trying to do that. We're just trying to grow the frame when the young calf. Beef cattle, they're on mama, out on pasture. So has there been a lot of research related to understanding those requirements for those calves?
Unfortunately, not much at all, Scott. Right? We've done a ton of research on how do we optimize dairy calf growth for milk production.
Right.
And in that system, we're looking at 900 grams of average daily gain, right?
Yeah.
Now we're trying to maximize growth, and we're trying to optimize growth for meat production. And it's a totally different system than the dairy system. And I think that's where the literature is really lacking. I did a study similar to what Dr. Johnson's describing with some muscle biologists out of Yukon. And in our study, what we looked at was just different milk replacers, right? We weren't even all the way to calf starter nutrition, but just different milk replacers. One that mimicked closer the concentrations of protein and fat from the beef animal, and one that was more of what we would call a conventional milk replacer, right? And those calves that got closer to what the beef mama would produce had a greater cross-sectional muscle fiber area than those calves that got conventional milk replacer. And so our data would also suggest we need better nutrition. We need more research on what is the best nutrition for those calves in order to stimulate that muscle development early on.
You signing up to do that research?
I'll tell you what, I told my graduate students after the last round of baby calves, and I thought I could sling weigh baby calves. I realized I'm not as young as I was in grad school, and I'm ready to keep my research in the feedlot, I think.
Very well. Brad, I want to circle back on something you had mentioned before, and that's the fact that these beefs on dairy crosses have less back fat, and so or external fat. And I'm wondering, does that make them more efficient, right? If they're not putting that energy into lipid.
Yeah. So historically, when you think about what affects feed efficiency or feed to gain conversion, composition of gain is what really drives that. So late in the feeding period, most feedlot cattle are deposited in the carcass transfer could be as high as 90%, but almost all that is adipose tissue or lipid, very little muscle at that point. That's why feed conversion traditionally gets worse. So subcutaneous fat is a large component of fat. In fact, the most abundant adipose tissue in a beef carcass is not back fat, it's seam fat or intermuscular fat.
Got it.
So we've probably done a poor job of assessing how much seam fat is in some of these beef on dairy compared to native, but historically, calf-fed Holsteins would have an acceptable marbling score with very low back fat, right? And interestingly, breeds in Asia that are noted for marbling, like the Wagyu and the Korean Hanwoo cattle, Chinese yellow cattle, they have tremendous amount of intramuscular marbling with very little back fat. So Holsteins and Jerseys, for the most part, are very similar to that. So what we found is in our study, and I'll show this data this afternoon, historically, the beef on dairy, if you get a really good, say, Angus Holstein or Sim Angus Holstein or a Charolais Holstein, Charolais Jersey, they're going to be leaner. They're going to have less back fat at that 12th rib. And their feed conversion generally is very favorable throughout the entire feeding period. In fact, our best conversions in all of our comparisons in Luke's study was an Angus Holstein F1. They had the lowest feed to gain value or the best feed efficiency, and I think most of that was because they had less back fat, and because composition of growth is the number one determinant for feed conversion. I think it's important that your audience know, especially if they're mostly on the dairy side. I know they look at, fat-corrected milk per pound of dry matter intake, right? That's a measure of efficiency on the dairy side, Clay. Feed efficiency is so important from a profitability standpoint in the feedlot. It comes in third on the list. So number one, what determines if you make or lose money, and we've lost a lot of money in the cattle feeding business over the years, is what you pay for the feeder calf. And right now, they're paying a lot of money for feeder calves, right? Depending on if it's day olds or 9 weights yearlings going into the feedlot. Number 2 is what you sell the animal for. So those are marketing decisions. That you choose to pay for the feeder calf. You choose what you're going to sell that for. Number 3 on the profit index is feed efficiency. And it is so critical. I'm going to show some data on Wednesday in my other talk where basically a 10% change in feed conversion, which isn't that much from a ratio standpoint, at $250 a ton feed on 250-day fed feedlot cattle was $56 a head difference. So that's a huge amount of money. So feed conversion is so critical. And so anything the dairy producers can do from a genetic standpoint that's going to have a favorable impact on lifetime feed efficiency, especially the feed efficiency of those animals in the feedlot, is a huge deal. And I think that's something we need to focus more on. So
How does days on feed impact that profit?
yeah, so it's generally on the profit equation.
Uh-huh.
So generally, as days on feed. That's an interesting deal. Historically, when we sold cattle on a live weight basis, generally days on feed started having a negative impact on profit because it followed feed conversion precisely. But now that we sell, almost all the beef that we sell today, Clay, is on a carcass basis. And very few cattle get marketed on a live weight basis. Earlier on, I mentioned something called carcass transfer. So what happens, and I lecture to my undergrads about this in a class, as animals mature, especially cattle, any animal, any mammal, the percentage of what I call non-carcass components, the hide, the blood, the GI tract, anything that comes off on the harvest floor goes into the offal barrels, is an early maturing tissue. And so as we feed cattle longer now, and the genetics have come, when I was a young person on the feedlot in high school and college age, you could tell when cattle were done because their intake dropped, they quit gaining, it was time to sell them. These cattle today, they're weighing 1,500 pounds, they're still eating, 23, 24 pounds of dry matter, they're still gaining 2.5, 3 pounds a day. All that, let's say they gain 2.8 or 3 pounds a day and they're weighing 1,500 pounds. The last 2-3 weeks of that, 90 to 95% of that 2 to 3 pounds goes right on the carcass. Now, unfortunately, most of that is fat or adipose tissue, okay? So what has happened is we can no longer look at feed conversion on a live weight basis. We need to adjust it for this carcass transfer because so much of that pounds is going. Now, albeit it's adipose tissue or fat, but we're still getting paid for that. And we're at record beef prices. A pound of hot carcass today is what, $3.25 a pound. And so that has changed the economics of how that's why we feed cattle so much longer, so because of carcass transfer.
Do you think I'm baffled by it? It took us this long to figure that out, right? I would dare say it took us COVID to figure that out when we were forced to keep them on feed longer. Yeah, and now we see, back in the day we always talked about, in grad school we always 150, 160 days on feed. That's the feedlot period. Now you're mentioning over 200 days on feed, and it's not all just beef on dairy, right? We're keeping native cattle on that long.
Conventional beef calves that say are weaned at heavy weights, 650-pound weights, they're feeding them 240 days, so that they'll go right into the feedlot weighing, say, 600 pounds. They'll put 1,000 pounds on. Some of these calves go out at 1,600 pounds in the northern plains, so they'll feed them 220, 260 days. They're gaining 4 pounds a day. But yeah, we feed cattle longer today than I think COVID was at. When we first started talking about carcass transfer, Tara, was when Zilpaterol was on the market, and we learned that we had to feed these cattle an extra 3 to 4 weeks to get the quality grade where we needed to. That's where we really started understanding carcass transfer.
And presenting carcass-adjusted average daily gains.
Exactly, and
yeah.
feed efficiency.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is here's where the dairy influence comes in, Clay and Scott. The one non-carcass tissue that will continue to grow throughout the feeding period until later and finally plateaus is the GI tract. And obviously whatever we do in the life of a bovine to get too much GI tract mass, that generally has a negative impact on dressing percent, or the percent yield of the carcass to live weight. And so you can just follow the dry matter intake curve of a pen of feedlot steers or heifers, and I can tell you exactly that as if it's still climbing, the GI tract mass is still increasing, and that's going to have a negative impact on carcass transfer. It's going to have a big negative impact on maintenance requirements for those animals, but also that's going to have a negative impact on dressing percent, because we do not want the GI tract mass to get too big in these feedlot cattle.
And that's a function of age?
It's really, I think, a function of dry matter intake.
Got it.
And a function of roughage in the diet. Roughage will stimulate,
Okay.
and so you guys got these mama cows, Holstein cows eating what, 55, 60 pounds of dry matter? That's not helping us
Right.
on the feed efficiency side with the beef on dairy offspring, because to get that level of intake, you have big GI tract mass. So
See what lower roughage
Well, but
diets, or
it's all in relationship, right? It's all relative. We want cattle to eat, because here's the other thing is, where I grew up in the northern plains, we still have big eating cattle, just like you have in Pennsylvania, Tara. And there's still a relationship of intake above maintenance is still the most efficient growth you will ever get. So I'm not a big fan of low intake cattle. There's certain feedlot nutritionists that promote really low intakes and steady growth, so they're very efficient. But I'm a proponent of productivity too, and to get productivity, you got to have cattle eat. So I'm not afraid of that. So.
Do you think some of these challenges on gut size, though, we talk about challenges, most of the cattle are sold on the grid marketing and yield grade, and producers complain about the packers always, because that's what producers complain about, right? But part of the challenge in these beef on dairy crosses and previously in the all dairy crosses, all purebred dairy animals was dressing percentage.
Yep.
Do you think you talk about how these cattle can eat? Do you think that's some of the challenges, the gut size in these animals, because of their history and their dams?
Yeah, I think it's partly genetic and partly management. That's a great point, Dr. Felix. And I'll show this data this afternoon. I'll have pictures of a Angus Holstein F1, a tremendous beef-looking animal, right next to a straight all beef animal out of the same sire, right? The Angus Holstein is actually 40 pounds heavier, the shrunk body weight at the end of the trial. They averaged 40-pound heavier shrunk weight. So from a live standpoint, they did phenomenal. Then the next slide, I'll show the carcass weight. The carcass weight between those two animals is identical. So the 40-pound heavier beef on dairy Angus Holstein cross yielded the same hot carcass weight as the all beef animal that was 40 pounds lighter from a shrunk body weight. I tell people that's all GI tract mass difference, the majority of that. So through selection, back to you want cows eating a lot of dry matter, right, from a milk production standpoint, the collateral effect of that, the unintended consequences, I think we do have animals in the beef on dairy mix that their GI tract mass is a tick higher. The other thing Luke's data showed, and I won't show any of this, they have heavier livers. There's a relationship between dry matter intake and liver size. You're going to get a bigger liver with a beef on dairy feedlot animal than you do a traditional beef animal. So
yeah, the one pocket of fat you didn't mention yet was KPH, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. Have you monitored any of that in your Simplot crossbreeding trials, and
so
how's that play in?
That's a great point. Generally speaking, because we've gotten a lot of cutout data from large packers, They'll let us in to do fabrication yields all the way through. And that's a great point. Generally speaking, this is a very generalized comment. Beef on dairy carcasses are going to have a higher percentage of internal fat, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. I said they're leaner, but the fat's coming in somewhere. So they will maybe, in some cases, have 1 to 1.5% more internal fat than traditional beef. And I think that's bore out in both the commercial data as well as some of the research findings. So, and then the other fat adipose tissue store that we've kind of neglected through the years, and I think we need to assess this for beef on dairy, is seam fat, the fat between the muscles, because that's actually the most abundant adipose tissue in a beef carcass. And so some people have thought that certain beef on dairy crosses, certain beef sires, will yield animals that have a little bit more seam fat compared to a native beef animal. So
I'm curious about that. In the plant that I work in predominantly, they're pulling that KPH out. And so that's been a point of, I won't say contention, but it's a point we can't measure, right? It's a data point we're missing. And so in your comments, I'm curious, how much more trim, and is that impacting these dressing percentages at all when you look at that KPH and the higher KPH in those crosses?
yeah, so there's one major packer in the U.S. that has been pulling the KPH out for many years and adjusting on a payment standpoint. I talked about this task force that's rewriting the red meat yield equation. Mm-hmm. They have already made a recommendation. I think in the next 5 years, all the packers are going to pull the KPH out. So what's going to happen is if you have certain genetic line, or if we produce cattle that are really heavy on the KPH side, they're going to get discounted from a carcass value standpoint, because that's not going to be in the carcass when it goes across the scale. So I think we need to be cognizant of that and try to kind of make that more consistent. But so I think that's one thing that's going to go away, is I think they're going to try to get all the packers to strip the kidney, pelvic, and heart fat off prior to going across the hot scale. And that's going to be probably a game changer, and may impact some of these breed combinations more than others. So
yeah, and our contracts, right? Yeah. We get paid on dressing percentage.
Exactly. So they'll adjust that, but there's easily you could go from a 65.5% dress easily down to a 62%, right, because some of these animals easily have 3.5 percentage units internal fat. So,
Brad, you spoke about the project where you use the same sire. Could you talk a little bit about the difference in the value that you got from those calves that were sired from the Simplot embryos versus those beef on dairy crosses, and how the valuation of that beef on dairy calf right now drives some of our marketing decisions?
Yeah, so in that particular study, and I'm not going to show any of the calf data today in my presentation, but we had access. I mean, we actually measured gestation length and everything in that study, because we were involved in the genetic decisions of the breeding of the Holstein and Jersey cows. And then a big part of that, and all that work's been published, but the calf data is published in Translational Animal Science. So we were interested in knowing, how when you raise like an all beef calf from a dairy in a hutch, does that change the lifetime productivity? And the easy answer is it really didn't change it. But the value, the value, we still had the highest beef value in the all beef embryos. If we just compare the embryos to the F1s, like the Angus Holstein F1s, I said earlier, the best feed efficiency on a live weight basis was the Angus Holsteins. They were 40 pounds heavier at harvest, but they yielded exactly the same hot carcass weight as the all beef embryos that were 40 pounds lighter at harvest. So that 40 pounds of carcass really drove the value of the all beef embryos in a dairy model system very high. But now these day-old calves are just extremely valuable right now, right? So a really high genetic index beef on dairy cross will bring what, $800 to $1,100 depending on what part of the country
In
you're
Pennsylvania, I'm paying $1,000
Yeah.
for calves this week.
in. And I Clay and Scott would know, but I'm guessing these dairy producers have $200 in them. So they're netting $800 from a beef on dairy. Holstein bull calves are probably $600,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
and that's an all-time high. And remember what I said earlier, the number one way to lose money feeding cattle, number one on the list, is we pay way too much for feeder cattle. So now we're starting with a calf that's worth $1,000 or more, and we're trying to make money. So, over my whole career of 30 years, the last couple of years, I've had more dairy producers call me and say, "Hey, Dr. Johnson, we want to retain ownership in these cattle. We have a beef on dairy symposium every other year at Texas Tech, and so we bring in a lot of dairy producers, and they see these carcasses and they get enamored with the cowboy image probably, and they want to feed cattle." And I'm like, I said, "Wait a minute. You're making $800 a head right now selling a day-old wet calf. You will never make that much money feeding that animal. Take the money and take it
the
to
money
the bank.
and run.
Take the money and run." But yet we want to do it. And it's like, no, you don't understand. You got such a value to that. You will never get more than you're getting on day one. And there may be opportunities if they fed them on the dairy, if they built a feedlot, they probably have economy of scale of feed production, right? That they might make a little bit more money. But I tell them, what happens when that $1,000 calf dies?
Right.
When it
Right.
is not so bad when it dies when it weighs 300 pounds. But what happens when it dies when it weighs 1,450 2 weeks before harvest?
When you've got
That's
500 days into it
exactly.
already.
And then they kind of like, yeah, maybe we should sell these day ones. It's sad, but the truth of the matter is the value of these feeder cattle today is off the charts. It's unprecedented. We've never had feeder cattle prices, and we've never had beef prices this high either. So. But I think it's a great opportunity for the dairy. It's another source of income.
Yeah.
Where that's netting $800 a head, and the embryos. Back to your question on the embryos, there's obviously significant more costs with the in vitro fertilized embryo. There's a debate about the conception rate of those embryos, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to really address that. But I think there was still some opportunities to add value to put in an all beef embryo especially in the Jersey side. We did that study to add value to the Jersey cow because it's because of the stature and the muscling degree of the Jersey. So I think the embryo calves that came out of the Jerseys looked the best economically for that dairy. So
I think it's critical. We think, and in the previous podcast, we talked about beef being a commodity business and the variation these animals bring. We look over the last 25, 30 years, and we talk about the break-even nature of cattle feeding, right? And I thought, dear God, who's paying $1,000 for these baby calves? I don't want to buy it. I have to because it's research, right? But I don't want to buy these baby calves for $1,000. So being the good nutritionist that I am, I made a spreadsheet, right? Get out your spreadsheet and you pencil in the calf starter and the milk replacer. And there is money to be made in them where prices are right now. I think the thing that we tend to forget is we buy that calf today, we're 5, 6, maybe even 700 days away from reaping a return on that investment. And our net profit in the cattle feeding section or segment, if we buy the calf today and use the sale price today, is $600.
Yeah.
But I don't have a crystal ball, Brad. Scott, Clay, I don't know if you do under the tablecloth. I can't tell you what those finished prices are going to be 2 years from now when we breed that cow, right? And finally get the progeny out of her.
Yeah,
So
because
I think that's key.
the gross value of a 1,500-pound fed steer or heifer, a fed steer today is what on a grid might be $3,300, right?
Shoot,
So
the cow's value today. You take the cow
so you
down.
got $2,300, and actually feed costs is relatively cheap compared to what we've had the last 10 years. But yeah, we're one BSE or one thing
That's
away
right.
from another hiccup. So there's a lot of risk, but there is risk management tools that producers can use. But you're right, we're well over a year away from marketing that animal, probably 16 to 18 months. There's a lot of risks that the biggest one is they're so valuable that any degree of death loss,
Right.
it can really hurt your bottom line on that. So those are good points. So.
Yeah.
You talk about the calls from the dairy. I had a dairy call me last year, and they're like, "We want to get out of the dairy business and into the beef business." And I said, "Great, breed all your cows of beef first, sell the calves, then sell the dairy cows, and then go and buy back your beef animals," right? And they wanted out today. They didn't have that long-term vision, right? They wanted out tomorrow. They want to be done milking cows tomorrow. And I couldn't get them to see that investment from that $1,000 calf was worth it to just keep milking a few months longer.
Interesting.
Tonight's last call question is brought to you by NiaSure Precision Release Niacin. Niacin is a proven vasodilator for heat stress reduction and a powerful antilipolytic agent for lowering high blood NEFA in transition cows. Protected with Balchem's proprietary encapsulation technology, you can be sure it is being delivered where and when your cows need it. Learn more at balchem.com/NiaSure.
So, Brad, this has been a very interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to the presentation that you're going to give later today. As a reminder to our audience, we will be videotaping that presentation, and it'll be available at balchem.com/realscience. As we close out here, guys, what I'd like to do is ask you to come up with 2 or 3 things that you'd like to share with the audience. Maybe something practical or some just good sound advice, as in sell those baby calves, right? But so if you wouldn't mind doing that, would greatly appreciate it. And Clay, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. So I want to reiterate what Scott said. I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk this afternoon. I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a minute. I've really enjoyed this, getting out of my comfort zone, being a dairy nutritionist here. So I actually want to make a plea to the people that are in charge of ASAS and ADSA. We need to get back to a JAM meeting. Mm-hmm. We're really missing these interactions across species. That used to happen at those meetings, and this is really great.
Yeah,
so
that's a great point, Clay.
I'd like to leave with that point on this one.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll make sure we forward to some of those folks on the ASA and ADSA committees. Tara, any final comments?
I'm a nutritionist, so I'm going to go back to nutrition. We have a tremendous gap in where the dairy nasum stops and where the beef nasum picks up. And right now, that gap is everything that Dr. Johnson just talked about, that we're trying to target to get optimal muscle development in these calves. And we've got a vacuum there. We need to fill that vacuum.
Yeah, great point. Dr. Johnson.
I think as both of the previous podcasts and this podcast, I really think in a very short period of time, we have elevated these beef on dairy crosses, and I'm generalizing everything, right? But we've elevated some of these to the point already that they'll rival native beef. And I grew up I'm a beef producer, but yet it's still beef, right? It's in the packing plant, hanging as a carcass, it's still beef. What I said throughout my podcast, I think we're 1 or 2 tweaks away. And as Dr. Felix just said, nutrition of these young calves, I think, is going to be critical, and of the transition cows, setting these calves up for success when they're in the uterus. But if we can tweak like the hindquarter red meat yield with everything we've done from basic of the sirloin forward already, we're going to have a very high quality, phenomenal, high palatability beef animal. And that, as I said earlier, what we learn on that beef on dairy space, we need to overlay that to the native beef herd, the other 80% of the cattle in the United States, to improve our efficiency, improve our meat quality, and our red meat yield of those as well. So I'm excited. I think there's a lot of opportunities. We've learned so much in a short period of time with beef on dairy that I got so many things in my head, I probably won't ever get to retire. So that's a good thing. So.
We've learned a lot, and there's a lot left to learn. Yeah. Excellent. Folks, this has been a great podcast. I've really enjoyed it. I'll echo what Clay said. Getting out of our comfort zone, it's kind of fun sometimes. So this has been very enjoyable. Appreciate your expertise, Tara.
Happy
Brad,
to be here.
it's been great. To our loyal listeners, this is the second in 3 podcasts that we're going to do. The next one, and I'll just do a little advertisement here, be sure to listen to it. It's going to be still beef on dairy. It's going to be all about economics, and that'll be with Dr. DeVries, Albert DeVries. We hope you learned something today. We hope you had some fun, and we hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour, and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email at anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars takes place on the first Tuesday of every month, with the top research and nutrition topics that will impact your business. We also include small ruminant, monogastric, and companion animal-focused topics throughout the year. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the upcoming topics and to register for future webinars. You can also access past webinars and search for the topics most important to you.